October 9th, 1943. A grass field near Varde, Denmark. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche circled the captured Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress with the systematic precision that had kept him alive through evaluating over 100 different aircraft types. The American bomber sat in a clearing barely large enough for its wingspan, surrounded by tall trees that should have torn it apart during landing. But the pilot had executed a textbook wheels-up approach on soft ground that shortened the landing roll just enough to avoid catastrophe. Lerche examined the aircraft's underside, where aluminum skin showed scrape marks but no structural damage. Forward fuselage intact, wing attachments undamaged. All 4 Wright Cyclone engines appeared serviceable despite the emergency landing. The bomber's most striking feature wasn't its size, though at nearly 75 feet long it dwarfed any German fighter. It was the gun positions bristling from every surface like the quills of a steel porcupine, a powered turret above the cockpit. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Another rotating sphere beneath the belly, flexible guns in the waist positions, a tail turret guarding the rear, and most troubling, enlarged cheek mounts on each side of the plexiglass nose. Lerche counted positions for at least 10 heavy machine guns, maybe more depending on internal configurations he couldn't yet see. Every position designed to create interlocking fields of fire that would shred attacking fighters. For 18 months, Luftwaffe pilots had been dying against formations of these bombers, not occasionally, not in acceptable numbers. They were being slaughtered in daylight battles that resembled flying through walls of 50 caliber fire. German fighter doctrine emphasized individual skill and aggressive tactics. Dive through the formation, fire a concentrated burst, break away before the gunners can track you. Simple, effective against any bomber Luftwaffe pilots had encountered before 1942. But the Americans had changed the mathematics of aerial warfare through brute force engineering. They built bombers carrying enough defensive firepower to destroy anything that came within effective range. Then they flew those bombers in tight formations where each aircraft protected the others, creating defensive boxes capable of generating over 700 heavy machine guns worth of concentrated fire. German fighter pilots called them Festung, fortresses, and the name captured their awful reality. You didn't attack a B-17 formation. You assaulted it like medieval soldiers storming castle walls, accepting casualties as the price of maybe, possibly, bringing down one bomber before your aircraft was shredded by defensive fire that seemed to fill every cubic meter of sky. Lerche had flown almost every German aircraft type in Luftwaffe service. He understood performance envelopes, structural limitations, and tactical employment better than most combat pilots. But he'd never personally experienced what made American strategic bombing so devastating. He'd read the combat reports, watched gun camera footage, interviewed surviving fighter pilots who described formations that seemed impossible to penetrate. Now he would fly directly into the heart of American air power, not to attack it, to understand it, to discover why German engineering principles, which had dominated European aviation for 2 decades, were proving inadequate against American industrial philosophy. The challenge wasn't flying the B-17. Lerche had piloted everything from nimble fighters to 6-engine transport behemoths without access to operations manuals or pilot notes. He flew by intuition, engineering knowledge, and an innate understanding of aerodynamic principles. He'd never crashed or seriously damaged an aircraft, despite testing types that killed experienced pilots who had the benefit of proper training. But evaluating an enemy bomber meant understanding not just its flight characteristics, but the entire tactical system it represented. The B-17 wasn't designed as an individual aircraft. It was a component in a formation that transformed vulnerability into overwhelming firepower through geometric positioning and coordinated defensive fire. German intelligence had been trying to crack that system since August 1942, when American bombers first appeared over occupied Europe. Lerche walked to the bomber's nose section and climbed through the forward hatch. The interior smelled of aviation fuel, gun oil, and the distinctive scent of American manufacturing, clean and precise with none of the improvisation that characterized wartime German production. The bombardier's station occupied the extreme forward position behind floor-to-ceiling plexiglass panels that provided panoramic visibility. Two flexible 50-caliber machine guns mounted in enlarged cheek positions dominated the compartment. Lerche examined the ammunition feed systems with growing appreciation for American mechanical sophistication. Power-driven belts eliminated the manual loading that complicated German installations. Each gun received continuous ammunition supply through motor-driven mechanisms that automatically cleared jammed rounds. The level of automation suggested American designers assumed average crew capabilities rather than expecting exceptional gunner skill. Behind the bombardier's station, the navigator's position featured a fold-down table and basic navigation equipment. Another flexible gun position allowed the navigator to contribute defensive fire during attacks. Moving aft through the narrow connecting passage, Lerche reached the flight deck, where genuine surprise awaited him. The cockpit was enormous compared to German single-seat fighters. Dual-control yokes for pilot and co-pilot, 4 separate throttle levers for individual engine control, a bewildering array of instruments, gauges, and system indicators spread across multiple panels. But what struck Lerche most was the automation built into every system. Electric trim controls, hydraulic boost for heavy control forces, automatic propeller governors, turbo supercharger regulators that maintained optimal boost pressure without pilot intervention. German fighters relied on pilot skill to manage complex systems manually. The Bf-109's notorious ground handling required constant attention to prevent torque-induced ground loops. High-altitude operations demanded careful manual management of supercharger settings to avoid engine damage. German doctrine emphasized that superior training would compensate for aircraft limitations. The B-17's design philosophy rejected that assumption entirely. American engineers had apparently decided their pilots shouldn't need to be exceptional. They'd automated everything that could be automated, eliminated every manual task that engineering could handle, and created an aircraft that average crews could operate effectively through procedural compliance rather than individual brilliance. Lerche settled into the left seat and began his pre-flight inspection without benefit of checklists or technical manuals. The layout was logical enough. Engine controls clustered near the throttles. Flight instruments positioned for easy scanning. Electrical systems grouped on overhead panels, but the sheer number of backup systems and redundant circuits revealed design priorities that seemed almost wasteful by German standards. Twin generators provided redundant electrical power. Multiple hydraulic pumps ensured system operation even with component failures. Crossfeed valves allowed any engine to draw fuel from any tank, preventing fuel starvation scenarios that routinely killed German pilots. The weight penalty must have been enormous, yet the Americans had apparently accepted mechanical complexity as preferable to pilot dependence on perfect technique and circumstance. Behind the flight deck, a powered turret dominated the upper fuselage position. Lerche squeezed past it into the radio operator's compartment, where another flexible gun position covered the upper rear quadrant. Every station featured ammunition storage, spent casing disposal systems, and carefully engineered gun mounts that provided maximum field of fire while protecting the gunner from slipstream forces. The bomb bay stretched down the center fuselage, but what caught Lerche's attention was the structural engineering. Massive main spars ran the wingspan, creating redundant load paths that could sustain battle damage without catastrophic failure. German bombers minimized weight through thin aluminum sections and narrow safety margins. The B-17 structure incorporated strength far exceeding theoretical requirements, accepting weight penalties to ensure survivability. Through the bomb bay and into the aft fuselage, Lerche examined the waist gun positions where 2 gunners would stand on each side of the aircraft. Flexible 50-caliber mounts with 1,200 rounds per position, the largest ammunition allocation in the aircraft. The positioning created overlapping fields of fire that covered approaches from beam attacks, the traditional German fighter tactic. The Sperry ball turret mounted beneath the fuselage represented mechanical sophistication Lerche had never encountered. A complete rotating sphere barely 4 feet in diameter, operated by electro-hydraulic systems that allowed the gunner to track targets through 360 degrees of rotation. Two 50-caliber guns with 500 rounds each, covering the belly approaches where German fighters hoped to find blind spots. Finally, the tail position where the gunner sat isolated in a remote compartment behind the vertical stabilizer. Twin 50-caliber guns with 565 rounds each, guarding the most vulnerable approach vector where diving attacks concentrated overwhelming firepower. Every component, every system, every design choice revealed American engineering philosophy that prioritized operational reliability over theoretical efficiency. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Danish field, Lerche completed his inspection with uncomfortable conclusions forming. The B-17 represented more than advanced bomber design. It embodied industrial warfare philosophy that German aviation hadn't anticipated. Luftwaffe doctrine assumed that superior pilot training and aggressive tactics would overcome equipment disadvantages. That belief had carried Germany through the first years of war against opponents whose aircraft roughly matched German capabilities. But the Americans weren't playing that game. They'd built bombers that didn't require exceptional crews to achieve mission success. They'd created defensive systems that made individual fighter attacks suicidal regardless of German pilot skill. They'd designed structures that could absorb battle damage that would doom any German aircraft. And they were producing these bombers in quantities that suggested industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. Tomorrow morning, Lerche would attempt to fly this captured fortress from the grass field to Esbjerg airfield, then on to Rechlin for comprehensive evaluation. The flight would be dangerous. He'd never flown a 4-engine bomber, never operated with a crew of 10, never managed the complex systems that kept a flying fortress airborne. But the real danger wasn't the flying. It was the implications of what he might discover. If the B-17 proved as formidable as German combat reports suggested, it meant Luftwaffe tactical doctrine was fundamentally flawed. It meant German engineering priorities had missed crucial lessons about industrial warfare. It meant that superior pilot skill couldn't compensate for systemic disadvantages in aircraft design philosophy. And it meant the war in the air was being decided not by individual combat prowess, but by industrial capacity and engineering approaches that German aviation had dismissed as inefficient American excess. The morning of October 10th, 1943 dawned clear and cold over the Danish countryside. Lerche stood beside the captured B-17 as German ground crews completed their hasty pre-flight preparations. They'd topped off fuel tanks, checked oil levels in all 4 engines, and verified that basic flight control systems appeared operational. But none of them had experience maintaining American bombers, and none could guarantee that critical systems wouldn't fail during flight. Lerche's challenge was straightforward in concept but terrifying in execution. Fly a 75-foot bomber with a 50,000-pound gross weight out of a grass field, barely adequate for the landing, without co-pilot, navigator, or the 9 other crew members who normally operated the aircraft. Solo. By intuition, using systems he'd spent exactly 1 day examining. The Wright Cyclone engines started with reassuring mechanical authority, each 9-cylinder, radial settling into smooth operation despite months of combat service. Lerche advanced throttles methodically, monitoring cylinder head temperatures and oil pressures that all indicated normal operation. The turbo superchargers spooled up with distinctive whistling sounds that German engines never produced. American engineering translated exhaust energy into manifold pressure through mechanical complexity that seemed almost wasteful compared to German single-stage superchargers. Ground handling proved immediately challenging. The B-17's tricycle landing gear configuration was unfamiliar to Lerche, who'd learned flying on conventional tailwheel aircraft. But the nose-wheel steering eliminated the torque roll problems that plagued German fighters during taxi operations. American designers had apparently decided that making ground operations easier for average pilots was worth the mechanical complexity and weight penalty of a steerable nose wheel. Lerche lined up on the grass field's longest axis and began his takeoff roll with careful attention to airspeed indicators calibrated in knots rather than the kilometers per hour he was accustomed to. The B-17 accelerated with surprising authority despite its massive weight. At 90 knots indicated, Lerche pulled back on the control yoke, and the bomber lifted cleanly away from Danish soil, with performance that seemed impossible for an aircraft carrying 15,000 pounds of defensive armament. The climb to safe altitude revealed the first genuine surprise about American bomber design. At 160 knots indicated airspeed, the B-17 was climbing at over 500 meters per minute, despite 4 engines producing only about 1,200 horsepower each. German doctrine assumed that such modest power-to-weight ratios would result in sluggish performance, but the turbo-superchargers maintained sea-level manifold pressure as altitude increased, effectively giving the B-17 performance characteristics of a much more powerful aircraft. Level flight at 3,000 meters altitude demonstrated handling qualities that defied expectations based on the bomber's size and weight. Control response was positive, but not oversensitive. Trimming the aircraft for hands-off flight required only minor adjustments to elevator and rudder trim tabs. American engineers had apparently invested considerable effort in making the B-17 stable and predictable rather than demanding constant pilot attention. Lerche experimented with single-engine operations by throttling back the port-inner engine. The bomber yawed noticeably but remained controllable through rudder pressure that was heavy but manageable. Feathering the propeller on the dead engine improved handling significantly. This was the redundancy that allowed damaged B-17 seconds to limp home on 3 or even 2 engines, a capability that no German single-engine fighter could match. The flight from the crash site to Esbjerg airfield took less than 30 minutes, but those minutes revealed performance characteristics that explained why Luftwaffe fighter pilots were dying in such numbers. The B-17 wasn't fast by fighter standards, cruising at maybe 270 kilometers per hour at economical power settings, but it operated at altitudes where German fighters lost performance, climbed faster than intelligence reports had suggested, and maintained controlled flight even with major system failures. Most troubling was the visibility from the cockpit. Lerche could see approaching fighters from enormous distances through floor-to-ceiling plexiglass panels. Every gunner position offered overlapping fields of view. German fighter tactics assumed that bombers had blind spots where attackers could approach undetected. The B-17 had no blind spots. Every approach vector was covered by at least 2 gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. Landing at Esbjerg demonstrated the bomber's forgiving flight characteristics. Lerche extended landing gear and flaps through hydraulic controls that operated smoothly despite combat damage the aircraft had sustained. Approach speed of 130 knots felt fast compared to German fighters, but the tricycle landing gear made the actual touchdown almost trivial. The B-17 settled onto the runway with minimal technique required, the nose wheel steering providing directional control without the ground loop tendencies that killed inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots during landing accidents. After refueling and thorough inspection by Luftwaffe maintenance personnel at Esbjerg, Lerche prepared for the longer flight to Rechlin Test Center near Berlin. This leg would require over 2 hours at cruising speed, giving him opportunity to evaluate the bomber's operational systems in depth. German fighter pilots attacked B-17 formations, flying missions lasting 8 to 10 hours over hostile territory. Understanding that endurance would reveal crucial intelligence about American strategic bombing capabilities. The flight to Rechlin provided time to explore the B-17's defensive armament from the gunner's perspective. Lerche experimented with several gun positions during cruise flight, discovering sophisticated engineering that made American defensive firepower so devastating. The powered turrets responded to control inputs with precision that suggested hydraulic and electrical systems far more advanced than German equivalents. Most revealing was the ammunition capacity at each position. Even after accounting for weight penalties, American designers had allocated enough .50 caliber ammunition to sustain defensive fire throughout extended combat engagements. German bombers carried lighter armament with limited ammunition that forced gunners to fire in short bursts. The B-17's gunners could maintain continuous fire, creating sustained fields of defensive fire that attacking fighters had to penetrate. As Recklin's runways appeared ahead through autumn haze, Lerche understood why this evaluation mission carried such importance for Luftwaffe leadership. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The captured B-17 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a complete system that revealed American strategic bombing philosophy. And that philosophy contradicted every assumption German aviation had made about air warfare. German doctrine emphasized pilot skill, aggressive tactics, and aircraft optimized for individual performance. American doctrine assumed average crews operating in coordinated formations where individual aircraft protected each other through overwhelming collective firepower. German fighters were lighter, more maneuverable, and dependent on exceptional pilots. American bombers were heavier, less agile, but designed so that average crews could execute strategic missions through procedural discipline rather than individual brilliance. Lerche landed the captured B-17 at Rechlin with mixed feelings about what systematic evaluation would reveal. The bomber was formidable. Its defensive armament was devastating. Its operational systems were sophisticated beyond German engineering standards. But the real question was whether German fighter tactics could adapt to defeat formations of these bombers, or whether American industrial philosophy had created strategic bombing capabilities that Luftwaffe air defense simply couldn't overcome through superior pilot training and aggressive combat doctrine. Over the next several weeks, that question would be answered with uncomfortable clarity. The evaluation would reveal not just the B-17's capabilities, but the entire American approach to industrial warfare. And what German engineers discovered would force Luftwaffe leadership to confront truths they'd been avoiding since American bombers first appeared over occupied Europe. The defensive armament wasn't just heavy, it was unstoppable. November 3rd, 1943. Rechlin Test Facility's Hangar 7 had been cleared for the most comprehensive evaluation of enemy equipment in Luftwaffe history. Oberingenieur Wilhelm Schmid walked the perimeter of the captured B-17 with measurement tools and technical drawings spread across workbenches that surrounded the American bomber like archaeological examination tables. His assignment was straightforward in concept: determine why German fighter pilots were dying at unsustainable rates against these aircraft. Schmid had spent 27 years perfecting German aviation engineering. He understood weight optimization, structural efficiency, and the careful compromises that created fighters capable of dominating European skies. But standing beneath the B-17's massive wing, examining rivet patterns and structural members that seemed unnecessarily robust, he confronted engineering philosophy that violated every principle of rational aircraft design. The defensive armament installation alone represented more questions than answers. 13 individual 50-caliber machine gun positions when fully configured, each gun weighing 64 pounds, each position requiring ammunition storage, feed mechanisms, spent casing disposal systems, and structural mounting capable of absorbing recoil forces during sustained firing. The weight penalty was staggering, over 3,000 pounds of pure defensive systems, before accounting for ammunition loads that approached another 2,000 pounds. German bombers carried perhaps 1/4 that defensive armament weight. Luftwaffe doctrine accepted vulnerability as necessary compromise for performance and payload capacity. But examining the B-17's gun positions revealed American rejection of that compromise through brute force mechanical engineering. The chin turret mounted beneath the bombardier's station represented sophistication Schmid had never encountered. Two 50-caliber guns in powered Bendix mounting that rotated and elevated through remote electrical controls. The bombardier aimed using computing gun sight while motors traversed the turret faster than human muscle could manage manually. 1,460 rounds of ammunition fed through power-driven mechanisms that automatically cleared jammed rounds without gunner intervention. Most troubling was the field of fire. The chin turret covered forward approaches that German fighter pilots considered their best attack vector. Head-on attacks minimized exposure time to defensive fire while presenting bombers' most vulnerable aspect where armor protection was lightest. But the chin turret transformed that tactic from calculated risk into probable suicide mission. Any fighter approaching from forward hemisphere faced two 50-caliber guns aimed by computing sight and fired by bombardier, who didn't need to manually track moving targets. Behind the chin turret, two flexible cheek guns mounted in enlarged blisters gave navigator additional forward firing capability. 200 rounds each position. Not enough for sustained combat, but sufficient to add concentrated fire during critical moments when German fighters committed to head-on attacks. Between chin turret and cheek guns, the B-17's forward defensive armament could generate over 1,800 rounds per minute of 50-caliber fire, covering approaches that German tactics depended upon. Schmid moved aft to examine the dorsal turret mounted above the cockpit. Twin 50-caliber guns in powered Sperry mount that rotated 360 degrees and elevated through full vertical range. 400 rounds per gun. 800 rounds total covering upper hemisphere against diving attacks from above. The turret responded to gunners' hand controls through electro-hydraulic systems that provided precision impossible with manual installations. German bombers mounted single manually operated guns in dorsal positions. Gunners fought slipstream forces while trying to aim and fire. Effective range was limited by human ability to track targets, while being buffeted by 200-mile-per-hour winds. The B-17's powered turret eliminated those limitations through mechanical systems that absorbed aerodynamic forces and allowed gunners to concentrate on target tracking rather than wrestling with gun mounts. The radio operator's position featured another flexible gun covering upper rear quadrant. 200 rounds. Limited ammunition reflected secondary role, but the positioning created overlapping field of fire with dorsal turret. Any fighter attacking from above faced crossfire from multiple positions that could concentrate fire during brief engagement windows. The ball turret represented engineering achievement that Schmid found simultaneously impressive and wasteful. A complete rotating sphere, 4 feet in diameter, suspended beneath the fuselage and operated through electro-hydraulic systems of remarkable complexity. The gunner occupied the turret in nearly fetal position, operating hand controls that rotated the entire sphere through 360 degrees, while elevating guns through full vertical range. Twin 50-caliber guns with 500 rounds each, 1,000 rounds total defending the belly approaches, where German fighter pilots hoped to find vulnerable areas. But the ball turret eliminated belly blind spots entirely. Any attack from below faced coordinated fire from turret that could track targets through impossible angles while maintaining stable firing platform despite aircraft maneuvers. The mechanical complexity was absurd by German standards. Hydraulic motors, electrical controls, ammunition feed systems that operated regardless of turret orientation. The weight penalty approached 800 pounds for the complete installation. Yet American engineers had apparently decided that eliminating belly vulnerability was worth accepting that enormous weight and complexity. Moving aft through the waist section, Schmid examined the flexible gun positions where 2 gunners stood on each side of the fuselage. Each position featured single 50-caliber mount with 1,200 rounds of ammunition, the largest allocation in the entire aircraft. The positioning created overlapping fields of fire covering beam approaches from both sides simultaneously. German fighter tactics increasingly emphasized beam attacks after discovering that head-on approaches faced devastating chin turret fire. But the waist guns transformed beam attacks into equally dangerous propositions. 1,200 rounds per position meant gunners could sustain fire throughout extended engagements without ammunition concerns. The volume of fire from both waist positions combined approached 4,800 rounds per minute, creating walls of 50-caliber fire that attacking fighters had to penetrate. Finally, the tail position where the gunner sat isolated behind the vertical stabilizer. Twin 50-caliber guns with 565 rounds each, 1,130 rounds, total defending against stern attacks where German fighters traditionally concentrated firepower while pursuing damaged bombers leaving formations. The tail guns provided covering fire that made pursuit attacks extraordinarily dangerous, even against isolated B-17 seconds. Schmidt's calculations revealed defensive capabilities that explained catastrophic Luftwaffe losses with mathematical precision. A fully crewed B-17G carried approximately 11,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across 13 gun positions. Combined rate of fire approached 12,000 rounds per minute when all positions engaged simultaneously. Effective range of 50 caliber guns was approximately 1,000 meters, though accuracy degraded significantly beyond 600 meters. But the mathematics of combat engagement told the real story. German fighters attacking in standard combat formations spent perhaps 10 to 15 seconds within effective defensive range during each attack pass. During those 15 seconds, a B-17's defensive armament could generate 3,000 rounds of 50 caliber fire directed at attacking aircraft, not random fire. Coordinated fire from multiple positions, creating overlapping fields that concentrated bullets along attack vectors. The ammunition itself revealed American manufacturing sophistication. Schmid examined cartridges removed from the captured bombers' magazines. 5.47 inches long, 1.71 ounces total weight. Available in multiple variants, including tracer, incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary, and standard ball ammunition. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate German fighter armor at ranges exceeding 500 meters. Most revealing was the belt loading pattern. American armorers mixed ammunition types in calculated sequences that maximized effectiveness against different target aspects. Tracer rounds allowed gunners to observe bullet trajectories and adjust aim. Incendiary rounds created visible strikes that coordinated multiple gunners onto single targets. Armor-piercing rounds ensured penetration capability against protected components. The systematic approach to ammunition loading reflected tactical doctrine that emphasized coordinated defensive fire rather than individual gunner marksmanship. German fighter construction revealed additional vulnerabilities when examined against B-17 defensive capabilities. Luftwaffe fighters used lightweight aluminum construction with minimal armor protection to maximize performance through weight reduction. A single 50 caliber armor-piercing round could destroy critical systems, penetrate cockpit areas, or damage control surfaces sufficiently to force emergency landings. Schmid's stress analysis of German fighter structures confirmed uncomfortable conclusions. The Bf-109G, Luftwaffe's primary fighter, weighed approximately 6,700 pounds empty. Its structure was optimized for air combat maneuverability through systematic weight reduction that created aircraft capable of executing tactical maneuvers that American bombers couldn't match. But that optimization created vulnerability to defensive fire that American engineers had specifically designed their bombers to exploit. A 50 caliber round striking Bf-109 wing structure could crack primary spars and force immediate combat termination. Hits to engine sections often resulted in catastrophic failures that gave pilots only seconds to bail out. Cockpit strikes were frequently fatal, despite armor plating installed behind pilot positions. The lightweight construction that enabled superior maneuverability also created fragility that made German fighters extraordinarily vulnerable to concentrated defensive fire. Meanwhile, the B-17's structure revealed engineering priorities that German aviation had dismissed as inefficient American excess. Schmid examined wing construction and discovered redundancy at every structural level. Twin main spars capable of carrying full flight loads, independently. Multiple stringers creating backup load paths. Skin thickness exceeding theoretical requirements by significant margins. The aircraft could sustain battle damage that would doom German bombers and continue flying through structural redundancy that compensated for combat damage. Flight testing over the following weeks confirmed performance characteristics that intelligence reports had documented, but Luftwaffe leadership had struggled to accept. Lerche conducted systematic evaluation flights that measured climb rates, service ceilings, cruise speeds, and most importantly, defensive visibility from various crew positions. The climb test revealed capabilities that challenged German tactical assumptions. At combat weight with full bomb load, the B-17 climbed at approximately 300 meters per minute to operational altitude of 7,000 meters. The rate exceeded German expectations based on power-to-weight calculations, but the turbo superchargers maintained sea-level manifold pressure throughout the climb, effectively giving the bomber performance of much more powerful aircraft. More significantly, the B-17 maintained that performance in formation with dozens of other bombers. American doctrine emphasized tight defensive formations, where individual aircraft protected each other through coordinated fields of fire. German intelligence had assumed that maintaining such formations would be difficult and would degrade under combat pressure. But flight testing revealed that American pilots trained extensively in formation flying, and that the B-17's automated systems made formation maintenance far easier than German experience suggested. Service ceiling testing took the captured bomber above 9,000 meters, higher than most German fighters could effectively operate. At that altitude, the Bf-109G experienced significant performance degradation. Engine power decreased. Control response became sluggish. Pilot fatigue increased dramatically due to oxygen requirements and cold temperatures. Meanwhile, the B-17 cruised comfortably with heated crew positions, oxygen systems designed for extended high-altitude operations, and turbo superchargers that maintained full power. The tactical implications were devastating for Luftwaffe defensive doctrine. American bomber formations operated at altitudes where German fighters struggled to intercept effectively. The bombers flew in defensive boxes that created interlocking fields of fire covering all approach vectors. Individual B-17 seconds carried enough ammunition to sustain defensive fire throughout missions lasting 8 to 10 hours, and the structural strength allowed damaged bombers to remain in formation, maintaining collective defensive capability even after sustaining hits that would destroy German aircraft. Lerche's most revealing test flight came when he evaluated defensive visibility from various crew positions. He flew the B-17 while ground-based German fighters conducted simulated attacks from multiple vectors. Radio communications with the fighters revealed that crew positions could observe approaching aircraft from enormous distances through floor-to-ceiling plexiglass panels that provided panoramic visibility. The bombardier spotted fighters approaching from forward hemisphere at ranges exceeding 5 kilometers. The dorsal turret gunner tracked diving attacks from above, with clear visibility throughout engagement geometry. Ball turret gunner called out fighters approaching from below while they were still beyond effective gun range. Waist gunners monitored beam approaches from both sides simultaneously. Tail gunner maintained continuous observation of stern sectors that German pilots considered blind approaches. There were no blind spots. Every attack vector was visible to multiple crew positions. Coordinated defensive fire could begin when attacking fighters were still beyond effective gun range, forcing German pilots to penetrate walls of 50 caliber fire before reaching positions where their own weapons became effective. The mathematics of that engagement geometry explained Luftwaffe casualties with brutal clarity. December 8, 1943 marked the final evaluation that would force German aviation leadership to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Oberst Heinrich Bauer, Chief of Fighter Development, arrived at Rechlin for comprehensive briefing on B-17 capabilities. Schmid and Lerche presented findings that documented American bomber superiority across every meaningful category of defensive capability. Schmid began with firepower analysis that used actual combat footage to illustrate defensive coordination. Herr Oberst, the B-17's defensive armament, represents systematic engineering solution to formation defense. Each aircraft carries 13 machine gun positions, generating combined rate of fire exceeding 12,000 rounds per minute. In tight combat box formation, a group of 18 aircraft can generate over 200,000 rounds per minute of defensive fire covering all approach vectors simultaneously. The numbers carried implications that extended beyond simple firepower calculations. Bauer examined photographs of damaged German fighters that had attempted to penetrate B-17 formations. Shredded wing sections, destroyed engine cowlings, cockpit areas torn apart by multiple 50 caliber strikes. The evidence documented lethality that German fighter construction couldn't withstand. Our fighters are optimized for maneuverability through weight reduction. Schmid continued. That optimization creates vulnerability to defensive fire. A single armor-piercing 50 caliber round can destroy critical systems or penetrate cockpit protection. But B-17 gunners are firing not single rounds, but continuous streams of ammunition that create probability of multiple hits during each attack pass. Lerche provided pilot perspective that confirmed engineering analysis. The visibility from crew positions eliminates surprise attacks. Gunners observe approaching fighters while we're still beyond effective weapon range. By the time our pilots reach firing positions, they've already been under defensive fire for perhaps 8 to 10 seconds. The concentration of bullets makes evasive maneuvering essential, but maneuvering degrades our own gunnery accuracy. The tactical dilemma was inescapable. German fighters had to close to within 300 meters to effectively employ their cannon armament, but closing that distance required penetrating defensive fire that began at 800 to 1,000 meters. The mathematics meant German pilots spent their entire attack approach under concentrated 50 caliber fire while unable to return effective fire until the final seconds of engagement. Worse, the B-17's structural strength meant that even successful attacks often failed to achieve kills. Lerche presented gun camera footage showing German fighters scoring apparent hits on B-17 seconds that continued flying in formation. The redundant structure absorbs battle damage that would destroy our bombers. They can lose engines, sustain wing damage, have control surfaces partially destroyed, and still maintain formation flying. I've examined combat reports documenting B-17 seconds returning to England with damage that should have caused catastrophic structural failure. But American engineering provides multiple load paths and backup systems that keep the aircraft flying. The implications extended to strategic considerations that German military leadership had been reluctant to confront. American industrial capacity was producing B-17 seconds at rates approaching 500 aircraft monthly. Each bomber represented investment of approximately $120,000 and required 10 trained crew members to operate effectively. But the Americans were demonstrating both industrial capacity and training infrastructure to sustain those production and personnel requirements indefinitely. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighter pilot training was being compressed to address mounting casualties. New pilots arrived at combat units with perhaps half the flight hours that early war pilots had received. They faced American bomber formations defended by weapon systems that killed experienced pilots who made slight tactical mistakes. The attrition mathematics were unsustainable. Bauer's final question revealed the crisis facing German air defense. Can our fighters defeat these formations using existing tactics and equipment? Schmid's answer carried the weight of systematic technical analysis. Not at acceptable casualty ratios, Herr Oberst. The B-17's defensive firepower, structural strength, and operational altitude create engagement conditions that favor the bomber. Our fighters must close to within their defensive envelope, sustain concentrated fire during approach, accept probability of catastrophic damage from multiple hits, and still achieve successful attack against structures designed to absorb battle damage. American doctrine compounds these advantages through formation tactics that create overlapping fields of fire. Attacking a combat box formation means engaging not individual bombers, but coordinated defensive system, generating hundreds of thousands of rounds per minute. The silence in Rechlin's briefing room stretched as German aviation leadership confronted engineering reality. They could no longer dismiss through institutional optimism. The captured B-17 had revealed not just aircraft capabilities, but entire American approach to strategic bombing that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. They'd built weapons system that assumed average crews operating in coordinated formations could defeat individual attacks by even exceptional enemy pilots through overwhelming collective firepower. The intelligence from Rechlin began filtering to Luftwaffe combat units through classified technical bulletins distributed in early 1944. Hauptmann Joseph Priller, commanding officer of JG-26, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, received his copy of the evaluation report on January 27th, while his unit was stationed at Lille Nord in occupied France. The document's clinical language couldn't disguise the revolutionary implications of what German test pilots had discovered. Priller had been flying combat missions since 1940 and had accumulated over 100 confirmed victories against Allied aircraft. He understood aerial combat through hard-earned experience that had kept him alive when most of his contemporaries were dead or prisoners. But reading Recklin's systematic analysis of B-17 defensive capabilities, he confronted tactical reality that experience alone couldn't overcome. The report documented what frontline pilots had been reporting for 18 months, but what Luftwaffe leadership had been reluctant to officially acknowledge. The B-17's defensive armament wasn't just heavy, it was systematically designed to create interlocking fields of fire that made traditional German fighter tactics catastrophically dangerous. Head-on attacks faced chin turret firepower that destroyed fighters before they could employ their own weapons effectively. Diving attacks from above encountered coordinated fire from dorsal turrets and flexible positions. Beam attacks penetrated walls of defensive fire from waist gunners, carrying 1,200 rounds per position. Stern approaches faced tail gunners who could sustain fire throughout extended pursuit engagements. Priller called his squadron leaders together for tactical discussion that would have been unthinkable in early war years. German fighter doctrine had always emphasized individual initiative and aggressive attack. Pilots were trained to press attacks until achieving kills or expending ammunition. Disengaging without scoring was considered failure of pilot aggressiveness rather than tactical prudence. But that doctrine was producing casualty rates that JG-26 couldn't sustain. The Americans have changed the mathematics of bomber combat, Priller told his assembled pilots. Their defensive firepower isn't designed to achieve kills against our fighters. It's designed to force us into defensive maneuvering that degrades our own attack effectiveness. Every second we spend evading their fire is a second we're not positioning for accurate shots. The formations are designed so that attacking any individual bomber means accepting fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The tactical revolution began with fundamental shift in German fighter doctrine. Instead of emphasizing sustained attacks until achieving kills, new tactics focused on hit-and-run passes that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Fighters would dive through formations at maximum speed, fire brief bursts, and immediately break away before gunners could coordinate effective return fire. The approach accepted lower kill probabilities per attack pass, but significantly reduced German fighter casualties during engagements. Most importantly, German fighters began targeting stragglers and damaged bombers that had left formation protection. The Rechlin evaluation had documented that individual B-17 seconds, while still heavily armed, lost the overlapping defensive fire that made formation attacks so dangerous. A bomber struggling to maintain altitude after sustaining flak damage became vulnerable to concentrated attacks by multiple fighters who could approach from different vectors simultaneously. But implementing new tactics couldn't change the fundamental strategic reality that Recklin's evaluation had exposed. American bomber production was overwhelming German defensive capacity through industrial scale that Luftwaffe couldn't match. In January 1944, when Priller's unit received the technical bulletin, American factories were producing over 400 B-17 seconds monthly. Each bomber-represented weapons system designed specifically to defeat German fighter defenses through defensive firepower, structural strength, and formation tactics. The human cost of that industrial warfare became apparent through casualty statistics that documented the collapse of German fighter pilot training infrastructure. In 1942, Luftwaffe fighter pilots received approximately 250 hours of flight training before combat deployment. By 1944, that training had been compressed to perhaps 120 hours, as mounting casualties and fuel shortages forced rapid pilot replacement. New pilots arrived at frontline units without the experience necessary to survive against American bomber formations that killed even veterans who made slight tactical mistakes. The captured B-17 at Rechlin became training tool for Luftwaffe fighter pilots who needed to understand their opponent's capabilities in order to develop effective countermeasures. Pilots rotated through Rechlin for familiarization flights that revealed bombers' capabilities from defenders' perspective. They observed visibility from various gun positions, experienced defensive fields of fire that their attacks would need to penetrate, understood automation and redundancy that made the B-17 so difficult to destroy. But understanding the enemy didn't change the strategic balance that had shifted decisively against Germany. By mid-1944, American P-51 Mustang fighters were providing escort throughout bombing missions that previously had been flown without fighter protection. The combination of long-range escorts and heavily defended bomber formations made Luftwaffe interception catastrophically expensive. German fighter losses during spring and summer of 1944 reached levels that couldn't be replaced through pilot training infrastructure that was collapsing under fuel shortages and Allied bombing of training facilities. The most tragic confirmation of changing tactical dynamics came through statistics that documented what Rechlin's evaluation had predicted. In 1943, before technical bulletins distributed new defensive tactics, average Luftwaffe fighter pilot survived approximately 3 to 4 months of combat operations against American bomber formations. By late 1944, after tactical adaptations based on B-17 evaluation, survival times had increased to perhaps 6 to 8 months. But that improvement merely slowed the inevitable. German fighter losses continued exceeding replacement rates, while American bomber production accelerated. The captured B-17 itself survived until April 19, 1945, when advancing Allied ground forces overran Rechlin Test Facility. American troops discovered the bomber still displaying Luftwaffe markings and test instrumentation from evaluation flights conducted throughout 1944. The aircraft had provided German engineers with comprehensive understanding of American bomber capabilities. But that understanding had proven insufficient to develop countermeasures that could defeat formations of aircraft specifically designed to overwhelm German fighter defenses through industrial-scale firepower. Wilhelm Schmid's final report on the B-17 evaluation, completed in March 1944, concluded with assessment that captured the strategic reality German aviation leadership had been reluctant to acknowledge. The American B-17 Flying Fortress represents engineering philosophy fundamentally different from German aviation doctrine, where we optimize aircraft for maximum performance through weight reduction and mechanical simplicity. American designers prioritize operational reliability through redundancy and automated systems. Where we emphasize pilot skill and individual combat prowess, American doctrine assumes average crews operating in coordinated formations to achieve mission success through collective firepower rather than exceptional individual capability. The defensive armament is not merely heavy, it is systematically designed to create interlocking fields of fire that make attacking any individual bomber require penetrating concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. The 1350 caliber machine gun positions generate combined firepower that forces German fighters to choose between effective attack geometry and survival probability. Pressing attacks to within effective weapon range means accepting casualties that our pilot training infrastructure cannot replace. But maintaining safe standoff distances means allowing bomber formations to reach targets without effective interdiction. The B-17's structural strength and redundant systems create survivability that compounds defensive advantages. Bombers sustaining damage that would destroy German aircraft remain in formation, maintaining collective defensive capability even after multiple successful attacks. American industrial capacity produces these aircraft at rates exceeding 500 monthly, while we struggle to replace Luftwaffe fighter losses from combat attrition. The strategic mathematics favor the attacker. Schmid's conclusion proved prophetic. By summer 1945, when Germany surrendered, Allied strategic bombing had achieved objectives that German air defense proved unable to prevent despite Luftwaffe's best efforts. American B-17 formations had flown over 600,000 combat sorties, delivered more than 640,000 tons of bombs on German industrial targets, and fundamentally altered the strategic balance through bombing campaign that German fighter defenses couldn't stop. The cost had been enormous for both sides. Over 4,700 B-17 seconds were lost during combat operations, representing roughly 40% of all aircraft produced. But American industrial capacity had absorbed those losses, while continuing to expand bomber formations and increase sortie rates. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighter losses had reached unsustainable levels that collapsed German air defense capability during the final year of war. The captured B-17's legacy extended beyond immediate tactical intelligence to fundamental lessons about industrial warfare that shaped post-war aviation development. American approach to bomber design, emphasizing defensive firepower, structural redundancy, and formation tactics, had proven decisive against German fighters optimized for individual performance through weight reduction and pilot skill emphasis. The philosophical clash between American industrial abundance and German engineering elegance had been settled through combat statistics that documented the effectiveness of weapons systems designed for average crews operating collectively, rather than exceptional individuals fighting alone. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war and later reflected on his evaluation flights in the captured B-17, with professional respect for American engineering that had created such formidable weapons system. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The Flying Fortress was aptly named. Its defensive armament created mobile fortification that German fighters could assault but rarely conquer without prohibitive casualties. We learned to respect American industrial philosophy that accepted weight penalties and mechanical complexity to ensure operational effectiveness under combat conditions. German aviation had pursued theoretical perfection through optimization. American aviation had achieved practical superiority through redundancy and overwhelming firepower. The lessons resonated through subsequent decades of military aviation development. Modern combat aircraft incorporate defensive systems, structural redundancy, and crew protection features that trace lineage directly to principles embodied in B-17 design. The emphasis on survivability through engineering, rather than pilot skill alone, became fundamental doctrine that shaped aircraft design philosophy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The captured B-17 had revealed not just the capabilities of one bomber type, but the future direction of military aviation itself. For Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war, memories of B-17 formations remained visceral decades later. The sight of combat boxes stretching across the sky, each bomber bristling with gun positions that could generate thousands of rounds per minute of concentrated fire. The sound of 50 caliber bullets tearing through aluminum skin when defensive fire found its mark. The knowledge that pressing attack meant accepting probability of catastrophic damage from weapons systems specifically designed to destroy fighters that came within effective range. Those memories embodied lessons that German aviation had learned too late to change the war's outcome, but that would influence military thinking for generations afterward. The 1350 caliber machine guns had made the B-17 Flying Fortress not just heavily defended, but genuinely unstoppable by German fighter tactics that had dominated European skies during early war years. American engineers had solved strategic bombing problem through brute force approach that emphasized firepower over elegance, redundancy over efficiency, and collective capability over individual brilliance. The captured B-17 at Rechlin had taught German aviation those lessons with systematic clarity, but by the time those lessons were fully understood, the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly toward an industrial power that could afford to build fortresses that flew. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.